presenters here to have a dialogue about one of the most important topics in reality and faith. This is a series that we've been doing at Washburn since 2009. Our first debate that we had was with Dr. Licona and Dr. Richard Carrier, and we're back to the same topic tonight. Our desire is that tonight that there would be a healthy discussion, a disagreement that is done in an agreeable fashion, that this would present not just an example of intellect and of research, but an example for how we can discuss and how we can dialogue with ideas and concepts that we have disagreements over. We want our culture to be moved together with dialogue instead of moved apart. And I'm grateful for our two presenters for this evening that they would come and be a part of this. Thank you for being a part of it also. We are also recording this, and they're working on getting the live stream started, and it will be live streamed as well for those that couldn't be here tonight. Our moderator for this evening, I'm grateful for Dr. Behrman to be here. Dr. Behrman has been at Washburn University for just about 20 years. I think about 18 years longer than he expected to be here. He is the Dean of the University Libraries, part of the administration here, and has had a great impact at Washburn. Also, Dean of the Center for Student Success and Retention here at Washburn. So, Dr. Behrman, thank you very much for being here this evening.
So, good evening. Sorry. I'm going to take that out because Dr. Licona is going to walk around with it. Good evening. I have a very simple job tonight. My job is to introduce the speakers and then to moderate their conversation. I love Craig's term, agreeable disagreement, because agreeable disagreement really is part of the academic life. So this is not a debate like many of you perhaps think of debates, presidential debates on television. So I'm not sitting out here staring at the presenters, cutting them off, yelling questions at them and all those types of things. What will happen tonight is that each of our speakers gets 20 minutes to kind of talk about their position. And then when they're done, they get 12 minutes to rebut the position of the other one. And then when they're done with their rebuttals, they get 10 minutes to ask questions of the other. At the end of that, we'll have a period of about 25 minutes for you to ask questions. So it really is a conversation. So we're very fortunate tonight to have two colleagues, two friends, two really outstanding scholars who are willing to enter into this conversation with one another and with us. I won't read their entire background on the back of the program, but it's there for you to learn more about them. It's there for you to learn how you can maybe buy a copy of one of their books. But I would tell you that we have with us Dr. Mike Licona, Associate Professor of Theology at Houston Baptist University, President of Risen Jesus Incorporated. He has a PhD in New Testament Studies from the University of Pretoria, the author of numerous books, probably most famously, The Case for the Resurrection. Mike is a member of the prestigious Society for New Testament Studies, and he has spoken on more than 100 university campuses and appeared on dozens of radio and television programs. Dr. Dennis McDonald has a PhD from Harvard University. He's taught New Testament and Christian origins at Goshen College, the Isla School of Theology, and the Claremont School of Theology. His scholarship has been devoted to the Christian apocryphal writings, the synoptic problem, and the influence of classical Greek literature. And I have to tell you that he has a new book coming out from Rowman and Littlefield called From Greek Mythology to the Gospels, How Jesus Became an Epic Hero. And how can one not want to read a book in which Jesus is referred to as an epic hero? So, again, my job is relatively easy. From time to time, you may see me stand up and gently nudge people to come to the conclusion of their comments. but this is not a debate like you see on television. This really is a conversation among scholars, an agreeable disagreement. So thank you for participating tonight, and I believe Dr. Licona was going to go first.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Well, this month, 50 years ago, the former Beatle John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono, they published the song Imagine. Now, this would be the #1 hit of Lennon's solo career. The music to Imagine is pleasant to the ear. The lyrics? Well, let's take a look at them. Oh, this is being moody on me again. There we go. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. So give up the idea, they're saying. Give up the idea of heaven. Give up the idea of God. He's not there. Above us is only sky, and live for this life only. They go on. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. And no religion, too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. So give up your worldview. Give up your preferred ways of being governed. And we can all live together in peace. Republicans and Democrats. Can you believe that? And then you'd also have capitalist, communist, even the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We can all live together in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. These lyrics, naive as they are, were meant to persuade, as Lenin himself acknowledged in an interview. He said, the song is anti-religious, anti-nationalistic, anti-conventional, anti-capitalistic, but because it is sugar-coated, it is accepted. Now I know what you have to do. Put your political message across with a little honey. Now, what I would like to do in the next few moments, I'd like to take up this challenge given by Lenin and his wife, and I'd like to imagine this kind of a scenario, that God doesn't exist, live your life only for today. And I'd like to just take a moment and address the female students here. Now, you're probably enjoying your experience here at Washburn. You're getting a decent education. You're making a lot of friends. Some of them are going to be lifelong friends. Perhaps you've even fallen in love. There's someone you want to spend the rest of your life with, and you're planning on doing so. And you're looking forward to your career. So things are looking really good for you. And so one afternoon before dinner, you decide to take a jog. As you're going along, a van pulls up beside you. Two guys get out, grab you, throw you in the van, and drive you to a warehouse in Kansas City where you are raped and assigned as a sex slave. All of your plans, your dreams, your hopes are forever gone. From this hour on, your sole purpose in life will be to satisfy the sexual lusts of others. Now, hopefully, this doesn't happen to any of you in here, of course. Unfortunately, there are many women and children in the world today, yes, even here in the United States, who are presently living this nightmare at this very moment. If God does not exist, then there is no one who will ultimately hear their cries. There is no one who will ultimately set things right and bring the evildoers to justice. I think about people who have sacrificed their lives, their limbs, their freedoms, the comforts of life to help others. People like Mother Teresa. If God does not exist, then goodness will be unrewarded. I think about death. 2.5 years ago, our family put our beloved dog down. Any of you have had pets, you know, and those pets have died, you know exactly how we felt at that point. We loved that dog, and she loved us. But she got old, 16.5 years, and she got sick, and she didn't want to eat any longer. So we took her to the vets. And we're all there in the room, the whole family, and I was holding the dog in my hands. And the vet came up and put something in her that caused her to go to sleep, and then put something else in her that caused her heart to stop. And then he put a stethoscope on her and listened, and he said, "She's gone." And all of us in the room were weeping. Now, I'd lost my parents a few years before that, and I grieved over them. But as a follower of Jesus, I have the confidence from the promise of Jesus that I'm going to see them again someday. He didn't give such a promise when it came to our pets. That's not to say we're not going to see our pets, but there's no promise, no real hope. So there I'm holding my dog, and I'm thinking just 60 seconds ago, she was alive. We loved her. And now she may never exist again. The breath of life is gone, extinguished, perhaps for eternity. And it was a crushing weight. And I got thinking, if that's the way it is for a pet, how much more it is when you lose a loved one, a spouse that you've been married to for 50 years, or a parent, or a sibling, or a child. If God does not exist, then injustices go unanswered. Goodness will be unrewarded, and death is final. To imagine such is a horrifying thing. I sincerely hope it is false. But there is another way to look at things. It goes like this. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God loved the world so much that he gave his only Son, that everyone who believes in him will not perish, but will have eternal life. Now that's really good news if it's true. But imagining that it's true will not move it 1 inch closer to being true. And the same thing can be said of the atheist view. And that's why evidence is important. Evidence. We want to look for that. And so what I want to do in the next few moments, I want to start off by looking at an early proclamation of the Christians. One of the earliest proclamations of the Christians, and this is something virtually 100% of all scholars agree on, no matter how skeptical they are. They agree that the earliest Christians said God had raised Jesus from the dead. And so I want to spend a little time looking at this, and I want to address 4 key questions related to this early proclamation that God raised Jesus from the dead. Number 1, how do we know? How do we know the earliest Christians were making this claim? Well, that's pretty easy to answer. Let's look at a little timeline here, and we can see that most scholars believe that Jesus was crucified and died in either April of 30 or April of 33. Doesn't matter which one of those two. They also agree that the Gospels were written somewhere between the years 65 and 95, or approximately 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death. Now, some scholars, like Dennis, will place one or more of the Gospels a little bit later. Some scholars will place one or more of the Gospels a little bit earlier than that. But by far, the majority of critical scholars today put them at these dates. But I don't want to focus on the Gospels tonight. I want to do something a little different. I want to focus on the period of time that occurred between when Jesus died and when the Gospels were written, because there's a lot that goes on in that period. We begin with a guy named Paul. And Paul was a skeptic who persecuted the church. And in the midst of doing so, he had an experience that he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. By the way, Dennis, are you hearing me correctly? Because I know when I was sitting here, it was really hard for me. Okay, good deal. So, in the midst of Paul persecuting Christians, he had an experience that he interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And that experience radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Paul became probably the #1 Christian missionary of all time. Later on, he wrote some letters, somewhere between the years, critical scholars think probably between the years 49 and 64. And in one of those letters, Galatians, his letter to the church at Galatia, he said that 3 years after his conversion, he went up to Jerusalem and he spent 15 days with Peter, the lead apostle and one of Jesus' closest disciples. He said he also saw James, the brother of Jesus, at that time. Paul then says that 14 years after that, he went up to Jerusalem again And this time he met with Peter again, James again, and another one, John, who was another one of Jesus' closest disciples. And he called them the pillars of the church. And he said his reason for going up this time was he wanted to run the gospel message past them to ensure he was on message with what they were preaching. And he said that they certified what he was preaching was what they were preaching. In other words, he said, they added nothing to my message. They extended the right hand of fellowship. It's like, you're good, Paul. Keep up the good work, buddy. Fist bump. So, Paul's saying he's preaching the same thing as the Jerusalem apostles are. Now, he may have been telling the truth, he may not have been. So, as historians, we look for corroborating sources. And we have some. I can only go over a few little things briefly, but one of those is a guy named Clement of Rome. And he wrote a letter to the church in Corinth. He did this in the first century, and in there, he places Paul on par with his mentor Peter and refers to Paul as the Blessed Paul. And then you got a guy named Polycarp. Now, some of you are going to get married someday, you're going to have kids, some of you are going to have boys, you're going to look at names, just remember some of these, like Polycarp, okay? Polycarp is believed to have been a disciple of the Apostle John, Clement of Rome, a disciple of the Apostle Peter. Polycarp wrote a letter to the church at Philippi, and in that letter, he says that Paul accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. And then he goes on and he quotes from one of Paul's letters and refers to it as sacred scripture. Wow. Not the kind of things you say about Paul if Paul had been teaching something radically different from your mentors, Peter and John. But precisely the kind of things we could anticipate they would say if Paul had been telling the truth, that he was on message with what the Jerusalem apostles were preaching. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that everything that Paul taught was exactly what they taught. However, it does give us great confidence that when we're at least talking about the gospel message, that is the basic message of Christianity at that time, when we're talking about the gospel message, when we hear Paul in it, we are likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. Now, wouldn't it be cool if we found a lost letter of Paul? Some archaeologist found a lost letter of Paul and said, and in that letter it says, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. And then he gave it. I mean, it's like that would be gold, historical gold, because we'd know what they were proclaiming. We wouldn't even need the gospels, and we'd have the basics of the Christian message of what Jesus' disciples were preaching. Well, guess what? We don't need a lost letter of Paul. We have such a letter in our New Testament. It's one of Paul's undisputed letters. It's 1 Corinthians. Written somewhere between the years 53 and 57 probably. And in chapter 15, verse 1, Paul says, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. And now he's going to give us an outline of that message. He says, I delivered to you what I also received. Now, here he is writing somewhere between 53 and 57. He says, I delivered to you when? Well, most scholars think around the year 51 when he established the First Baptist Church of Corinth. And that's when he delivered it to them, and he received it before then from the apostles. So I delivered to you what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared. And then he lists some of the appearances. To Peter, to the 12, to more than 500, to James, to all of the apostles. And then Paul adds his own name to the list. So here we know what the apostles, those who would actually follow Jesus and known him, we know what they're proclaiming shortly after his death. Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and the appearances to individuals, to groups, to friend and foe alike. And Paul goes on to say, same chapter, whether I or they, that is the other apostles, this is what we preached, and this is what you believed. So how do we know that they were proclaiming God had raised Jesus from the dead? There you go. You got an apostle who was an eyewitness, claims to be an eyewitness himself. He knew the other apostles, and we know that they certified that his gospel message was the same as theirs, and that gospel message included the resurrection and appearances of Jesus. Question number 2, what did they mean by resurrection? Did they just mean some sort of a metaphor that Jesus' teachings still live on today, even though he's dead? Well, here Paul's going to address this further in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. He's addressing some questions the Corinthians are asking him. And it seems by their questions that there are some people in Corinth who are saying to the Christians, look, you Christians and many Jews believe in what's called the general resurrection, that God's going to come back, he's going to raise everyone who ever existed back to life, and he's going to judge everyone, and the righteous are going to get eternal life. Let me tell you, there is no such thing as a general resurrection. When you die, that's it. Above us is only sky. So imagine there's no heaven and live for today. And so they're writing to Paul and they're saying, look, Paul, we believe in a general resurrection, but what's it going to be like? I mean, now we're thinking, are we going to get our bodies back? What's it going to be like? And so Paul's going to answer those questions in this chapter. I'm only going to touch on those things that relate directly to what we're discussing this evening. Paul is relating our resurrection to the resurrection of Jesus. And he's saying, yes, there's a general resurrection. In fact, it's already begun with the resurrection of Jesus. It's two parts. First him, and then we're going to be raised when he returns. So these are inextricably linked. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, we're not going to be raised from the dead. So Paul says this, if the dead are not raised, then Christ was not raised. And if Christ was not raised, your faith is worthless. You are still in your sins, then also those who have died in Christ have perished. And then he says, if I fought wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, what have I gained? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. If there is no afterlife, if this life is all there is, then get everything out of it you can. Get all the sex you can, get all the weed you can, cheat on your test if you can get away with it. Because there's no one to be accountable to ultimately. It's just you. Live your life for today and enjoy it as much as you can. But Paul goes on and he says, but Christ has been raised. Therefore, we will be raised. Therefore, the Christian life is worth living, even if it involves persecution. That argument by Paul makes no sense whatsoever unless they truly meant that this man Jesus had been dead and he had been alive walking around. He's still alive. That's what they meant by resurrection. Number 3, is it true? Well, historians look for, they take the evidence or facts, knowable facts, and they formulate hypotheses to see which one best accounts for the data. And the one that best accounts for them is what regarded as what probably occurred. So let's look at a few things. Number 1, Jesus' disciples taught he was raised from the dead. We saw that. That means it wasn't a legend that developed over time because we can trace it back to the original disciples of Jesus. We also know it probably wasn't a lie because we've got at least a dozen ancient sources that report that these same disciples were willing to suffer continuously. They were willing to die for their gospel proclamation, and we know at least some of them did as martyrs. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that what they believed was true, because we know that people of other religious beliefs and worldviews are willing to suffer and die for those views. But it does show that they sincerely believed what they were proclaiming is true. Liars make poor martyrs. So the disciples were not only proclaimed that Jesus rose and had appeared to them, they actually believed it. Second, Jesus' disciples taught he appeared to individuals and groups, which suggests it probably wasn't hallucinations. Multiple studies over the years, more than a century, have shown that only about 7% of those who are bereaving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination. Moreover, Paul was, and you got 100% of the disciples claiming they saw him. And then you got Paul. He believed Jesus was a failed prophet and a false Messiah. And so Jesus would have been the last person in the universe Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. He wasn't grieving. Third, Jesus' disciples intended for us to interpret the resurrection as an actual event. So it wasn't a metaphor. Now, there's other alternative explanations I could bring up. I don't have time for that. What I can say is when you subject hypotheses to strictly controlled historical method, you find that the resurrection hypothesis is not only the best explanation for the data, it is the only explanation that can account for it adequately. Third and final question, does it matter? Absolutely it matters. Truth matters. And if Jesus rose from the dead, it means that Christianity is probably true. And that means that God loves you. And it means that you have great value, not because of anything you've ever accomplished or will accomplish, but because you've been made in God's image. It also means that injustices will be answered, goodness will be rewarded, and death is not final. That's a good thing indeed. Thank you.
I'm a historian, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a preacher, and my goal is the same as Dr. Lincoln. I want to deal with the evidence, and I want to deal with it as a historian. And then I'm going to make some conclusions that answers the question, why did early Christians, what did they mean when they said God raised Jesus? By the way, the language in the New Testament is almost always consistent that Jesus did not rise from the dead. God raised Jesus from the dead. Jesus is a passive, he's passive. It is God who's the agent. Now I want to this is the text that Professor Lincoln mentioned, and so I won't deal with it again, except to say what the Corinthians meant by it is that the soul of Jesus was seen being liberated from his body. There is no resurrection from the dead, but they apparently did believe that Jesus was seen. But what's more important is that Paul did not believe it was a bodily resurrection, a physical bodily resurrection. For him, it was a spiritual body, and he insists that flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of God. I'll run over this. I agree with my colleague on that. But the point is, neither the Corinthians nor Paul interpreted the tradition cited in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 to mean that God raised Jesus' physical body. Got that? The Corinthians thought it was Jesus' soul liberated from the body, and Paul thought it was a spiritual body. My argument this evening is going to be in these bullet points. I'm going to be interested in whether the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection it conforms to what we find in Paul, and we're going to find that it doesn't at all. The two earliest Gospels explicitly rejected the view that Jesus appeared to anyone after his death. That's the Q document and Mark. The Gospel of Matthew altered Mark by adding an appearance to the 11, not to the 12 disciples in Galilee. Luke added extensive narratives of Jesus' corporeal appearances in Jerusalem, but not Galilee, as is in Matthew. And he created his stories by imitating the last book of the Odyssey. John crafted stories of appearances to the Magdalene and doubting Thomas by imitating Luke's imitation. The Gospels then call into question the historical reliability of the tradition, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. So what? One should read the gospel resurrection narratives not as collaborating historical reports, but as creative literary fictions to make God's vindication of Jesus' message and career meaningful to later diverse social and political challenges. This is the Lost Gospel Q, which I have attempted and others have attempted to recreate. Many of you may be Q skeptics, but you'll hear in what I'm going to read words that appear also in Matthew and Luke. Jesus says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those sent to her. Look, your house is forsaken. I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. That's Jesus' return victorious. You will not see me. Then the Gospel of Mark. The earliest surviving gospel is the one attributed to Mark, written soon after the Jewish War. In Mark's account, when 3 women entered Jesus' tomb, they saw a young man sitting inside, and the youth told them, you seek Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He was raised. Notice God is the agent. Go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. And they left and fled from the tomb, for trembling and confusion had seized them. But they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. In other words, the disciples never saw Jesus. They never got word to go to Galilee. And the way that, the reason is that Mark wanted, if there was an appearance of the risen Jesus to the disciples, he should have told them to get out of Jerusalem before the war. That would have saved them from carnage. But blame the women. They didn't tell, and therefore the Jerusalem church suffered in Jerusalem. Mark is insistent that the women never told and the disciples never saw Jesus in Galilee. Rather, they suffered. This is historical, rock-ribbed information. I'm not making this up. Take a look at the text of your New Testament. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus appears to 11 disciples in Galilee, and he clearly is correcting Mark. So here's what Mark wrote. They left and fled, these are the women, from the tomb, for trembling and confusion, had seized them. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. But Matthew corrects it. They left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. And Jesus then appears to them and repeats the message, and the disciples do go to Galilee and receive the Great Commission. None of this, in my view, has historical value, except to tell us about Matthew's church. I want to introduce to you, I missed a slide. In Paul's 2-volume work, we find him disagreeing with Paul. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says, flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of God. Jesus' body is a spiritual body. But in Luke, Jesus himself says, handle me and look, a mere spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have, and he actually ate. He lived with the disciples for 40 days in Jerusalem and then had a bodily ascension. Luke and Paul disagree. And that's all the more amazing because Luke knows 1 Corinthians, apparently, and he never says anything about the appearance to 500. I think he was skeptical of it. What I want to spend most of my time on is, however, mimesis criticism. And here's my own dactylic hexameter in imitation of Homer. Gospel texts seldom retain memories of actual events. More often than not, they contain mimesis of seminal texts. Mimesis is simply the Greek word for imitation. And the book that was most imitated in classical antiquity was the Homeric epic, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And people learned in school how to compose by taking themes in Homer and rewriting them in prose. So, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong direction here. I'm going to tell you the story of Odysseus coming back after 20 years and introducing himself to his father. I will test my father whether he will recognize me with his eyes or not recognize me, because I was gone for so long. He found his father alone in his well-tended orchard. "Old man, whose slave are you?" His father responded to him, shedding tears, "Stranger, you have indeed arrived at the land about which you asked, but insolent and wicked men now have it. If you had found him alive in the land of Ithaca, he then would have reciprocated well with gifts and sent you off with a good guest gift." Odysseus then says, "Father, I here am that man whom you seek." He says, "If you are indeed my son Odysseus who has come home, tell me some recognizable sign that I may be persuaded." In response, crafty Odysseus told him, "First consider with your eyes this scar that a boar gouged with a white tusk, and the knees and dear heart of Laertes melted when he recognized the sure signs that Odysseus showed him." Then Odysseus says, "Let's go to your home that sits beside the orchard. Earlier I sent Telemachus, the cattleman and the swineherd there, so that they might quickly prepare a dinner." Thus conversed the two of them, and they went off to the good house. Now, to save time, I'm going to read the parallels only in the right-hand column in Luke, because we've already done a survey of the story in the Odyssey, but you're going to see the similarities. So I'd like your eyes to follow the left-hand column and your ears to follow the right. Jesus died but returned to Jerusalem alive. Jesus met two disciples on the road outside the city, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Same words in Greek. The disciples were sad as they walked. The sojourner, Jesus in disguise, asked questions. Cleopas mourned the death of his Lord and the violence of the Jewish authorities. The risen Jesus spoke to the men about himself in the third person, but they still did not recognize him. Jesus revealed his identity by breaking bread with them. Their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. Again, the same words. They rose up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 gathered there. They had already broiled the fish. Jesus told his disciples to look at the wounds on his hands and feet. "It is I myself." Same words in Greek. At the meal, the disciples were terrified, but Jesus comforted them. Now, here are the criteria of mimesis criticism that allows one to identify parallels between two texts. The first is accessibility, the likelihood that an author of a later text had access to the proposed model. Analogy determines if other authors imitated the same model. The more models one can posit between two texts, the stronger the case that they issue from a literary connection. Order examines the relative sequencing of similarities in two works. A distinctive trait is anything unusual in both the targeted model and the proposed borrower. Interpretability asks what might be gained by viewing one text as a debtor to another. And parallels satisfy ancient recognition if one can show that ancient readers noted the similarities. The Gospel of John. The stories of the Magdalene and Doubting Thomas are imitations of Luke, which had been imitations of the Odyssey. So in Luke, Jesus died but returned alive. In John, Jesus died but returned alive. Two disciples traveled outside Jerusalem. Mary Magdalene was alone at the garden tomb. Mary Magdalene and two other women did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. Mary Magdalene stooped into the tomb and did not find the body of Jesus. Suddenly, two men, later called angels, in radiant clothing stood before them. Instead, she saw two angels in white garments sitting there. And then I'll just read the right-hand columns. Again, your eyes can be on the left. The angel said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She wept over the crucifixion of her Lord. Mary, "They have removed my Lord, and I do not know where they placed him." Once she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, and did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom do you seek?" She still doesn't recognize him. She, supposing, same word in Greek, that she was a gardener, said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him off, tell me where you have placed him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." On turning, she told him in Hebrew, "Rabboni." She now recognized her teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." Whereas in Luke, Jesus says, "Handle me and look." Mary Magdalene went to tell the disciples, "I have seen the Lord," and that he had said these things to her. I'll skip over Euripides. I'll read it. In Euripides, Pentheus' mother has beheaded him in madness and didn't recognize that she had done so. And when she comes back to her senses, she asks, "Where is the body of my son?" And she uses the same word for, "Where have you placed him?" So whereas Agave was horrified, Mary was jubilant. And then doubting Thomas. In the Luke column is in the left. I'll read the right. Jesus stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be to you," or "Peace to you." And having said this, he showed them his hands and side, so the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. So little historical confirmation in the Gospels for the Pauline tradition. The Corinthians interpreted 1 Corinthians 15, 5-8, and his appearance to the 12 as proof that Jesus' psyche, his soul, had successfully escaped his soma, his body. Paul insisted that Jesus' spiritual body was raised, not one with flesh and blood. Hughes Jesus says that after his death, no one will see him before he returns victorious. Now remember, this is all in the Bible, right? I'm just giving you the evidence. Mark denies the 11 disciples an encounter with their risen Lord. In Matthew, the 11, not the 12, go to Galilee and see their Lord, even though some of them remain skeptical. The Lucan evangelists insist that the 11 lived with the risen Jesus for 40 days in Jerusalem before he ascended with the physical body to heaven. His accounts of the appearance on the road to Emmaus and the revelation of Jesus' wounds are not based on historical memory, but on the last book of Homer's Odyssey. The Gospel of John crafted its appearances to the Magdalene and doubting Thomas after Jesus' appearance in the last chapter of Luke. No reliable historical information here. Here's my conclusion. Jesus had defiantly denounced the religious and political elites who oppressed the social marginal. As a result of his success as a social radical, he suffered an ignominious crucifixion. His followers could not imagine that his God would allow his death to terminate his mission or legacy. And they all, in various ways, affirmed that God vindicated Jesus and his career so his mission could be continued. But no one would have been more shocked that Jesus rose from the dead than he. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm on. So remember now what happens next is each of our speakers will offer a rebuttal to the other, after which they'll ask each other questions for 10 minutes. So.
Well, thank you, Dennis. In my opening statement, I contended that shortly after Jesus' death, a number of his followers had experiences they were convinced were appearances of the risen Jesus to them. They had also claimed that these experiences occurred in both individual and in group settings. There was also a skeptic named Paul who was persecuting the church, and he likewise had an experience he was convinced was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. I showed how all of this can be known from sources that predate the Gospels. Finally, I contended that the resurrection hypothesis is not only by far the best explanation of these things, It is the only explanation that can account for them adequately. Now, in Dennis's opening statement, he made a couple of assertions. One of that is that the Gospels are almost entirely literary fictions that were created in order to imitate, and compete with Greco-Roman fictions, especially the Homeric epics. He also called into question the meaning of resurrection, that it didn't mean he was raised bodily, it was raised spiritually. So let's talk about a couple of these things. First of all, what was Paul's view of resurrection, since whatever his view of it was can be traced back to the apostles as well? What about, was he raised spiritually? Was he raised spiritually, not physically? And here, many scholars get 1 Corinthians 15 confused. He talks about how a body is sown a natural body and it's raised a spiritual body. The two Greek terms that are used there for natural is psychikos, from which we get the term psyche, soul, for psychology. The other word is pneumatikos, from which we get the word spirit. So it's natural or soulish versus spiritual. Now, what do those terms mean? Well, I did a study when I was doing my doctoral research, and I found, I think it was 846 occurrences of the term psychikos in the extant Greek literature from the 8th century BC through the 3rd century, 1100 years. And you want to know how many times that term meant something like physical, as the New Revised Standard Version, the Amplified Bible, the Jerusalem Bible, and a few other translations incorrectly render it. They render it as it's sown a physical body, raised a spiritual body. Well, those 846 occurrences, not a single one of them mean physical. Not a single one in the ancient literature. What about spiritual? Well, it could mean ethereal, like an immaterial body, as Dennis wants to interpret it, it seems. But it can also mean spiritual in a little different sense. Like, for example, in chapter 2 in 1 Corinthians 15, same letter, Paul says, the natural man, psychikos, doesn't understand the things of the Spirit, for they are spiritually, pneumatikos, spiritually discerned. So he's not saying, contrasting the physical with the spiritual. He's saying people who are spiritually minded here. And in the context of 1 Corinthians 15, he's saying, look, the body that is sown, that's buried, is one that is natural insofar as it's animated by our typical organs, heart, kidneys, lungs, liver. But it's raised a spiritual body. It's one that's animated by the Holy Spirit. Why do we say this? Well, number one, Paul had some other terms he could have used if he was trying to compare physical with spiritual. He could have used sarkikos, which means physical, fleshly, okay? But he doesn't use that. And he had already used those two terms in 1 Corinthians 9, just a few chapters earlier. So he already had those and used them in this sense. Paul believes in physical resurrection because Romans 8:11, he said, the Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. And then in 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 through 17, he says, look, I don't want you guys to grieve as those who have no hope. And then he talks about how Christ will bring back with him those who belong to Christ, the spirit of dead people who were followers and who were saved, who had already died as followers of Jesus. And he says, then the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised first. Well, wait a minute. How are they going to be raised if they're already coming back with him? Well, it's pretty simple. He's bringing back the spirits back with him, and then they're reunited with their corpses, which are then resurrected and transformed into an immortal, glorious, powerful body that's animated by the Holy Spirit. It's a physical, bodily resurrection. It's not spiritual in the sense that Jesus was seen as an immaterial being. Well, what about chapter 15 when Paul says flesh and blood cannot enter the kingdom of heaven, but yet Luke says in Luke 24, Jesus says, a spirit doesn't have flesh and bone as you see that I have. This is a confusion of terms. As Joachim Jeremias said back, I think it was 1955, and he's not been refuted. And in fact, I looked up all the sources myself and found some additional ones. In all the ancient literature, whenever you see the term flesh and blood in ancient Jewish literature, it is always a Semitism that simply means the mortal body with all of its weaknesses. It's kind of like, hey, he's a cold-blooded murderer. That is a figure of speech. It's an idiom. It's not saying that his blood, if you took the temperature, is below 98.6. Flesh and blood was a Semitism, a figure of speech. It did not literally mean something physical. Flesh and bone is not the same thing. So there's no contradiction there. Now, he talks about Q. He says there's no resurrection in Q. Well, guess what? There's no death of Jesus in Q either. But you'd be hard-pressed to say that this Q source didn't think of the death of Jesus. So we got to say, well, why was there no death of Jesus? Why was there no resurrection in Q? Because Q, according to virtually all scholars out there, Dennis is an exception, but according to most all scholars out there, Q is a sayings literature. When you look at the Q material in Matthew and in Luke, you find that it is just about exclusively sayings, teachings of Jesus that's just peppered throughout those Gospels. There's no narrative attached to it. So what's going on? Well, it could have been notes taken by one of the disciples while Jesus was alive, and therefore there was no death or resurrection. Neither had occurred. What about no resurrection appearances in Mark? Well, that's fairly easy to explain. As many scholars, not a majority, but as many and many significant scholars think, the ending of Mark may very well have been lost. When he says they went away and said nothing to no one, well, what did that mean? Well, Mark uses the same exact phrase in chapter 1, verse 44. Jesus heals a leper, and he says, go and show yourself to the high priest and say nothing to no one. But what does that mean? It means don't say anything to anyone along the way. Go directly to the priest and show yourself to him and tell him what the Lord has done. What Mark is probably communicating here is out of fear and trembling, they said nothing to no one along the way. They went directly to the apostles and told them. Besides, Jesus told the disciples that after he died, he would go ahead of them to Galilee. And the angel was reminding the women of that. Now, Dennis thinks, remember, he said that this would explain why the disciples never saw Jesus. The women never told the disciples, therefore they didn't go to Galilee and they missed Jesus. But remember, in my opening statement, I showed how we can establish with certainty from sources that predate all the Gospels, we can establish that Jesus' disciples sincerely believed and were proclaiming publicly that Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to them. So I know in his opening statement, he's not there to answer me, he's there to present his own, but I'd be really curious to have him answer in his rebuttal, how is it that we can establish that Jesus' disciples are out proclaiming for a few decades before Mark is even written that Jesus rose from the dead and had appeared to them, and then Mark is saying the women said nothing to the disciples, and that's to explain why the disciples didn't see Jesus? How does that make sense? Finally, he says that the Gospels are largely literary fictions intended to imitate and compete with the Homeric epics. He's not been able to convince many scholars in this, and there's some very good reasons. One is that you can find similar details in just about anything. Now, many of us are aware of a plane that took off from Massachusetts early one morning, and just shortly after 9 a.m., it flew into one of the tallest skyscrapers in the world in New York City, killing everyone on board. Now, I'm referring to the B-25 that flew into the Empire State Building on July 28th, 1945. Yes, that actually happened. I can understand why you thought I was thinking of the 767 that flew into the South Tower on 9/11. The similarities are so striking. Both planes took off from Massachusetts. Both flew into a New York City skyscraper. Both killed everyone on board. Both planes flew into the same floors, by the way, the 78th to 80th floors. And both planes flew into the buildings during the same hour of the day, between 9 and 10 a.m. There's no relationship between them. Now, I suppose 1,000 years from now, if the Lord hasn't returned, you can have a revisionist historian say, 9/11 never happened. Videos and photographs can be fabricated, and look at all the clues that were around. 9/11. Who do you call when you have an emergency? 911. What was the emergency? U.S. had an economic recession at the time, symbolized by the collapse of the 2 World Trade Center towers. The plane that crashed into the Pentagon symbolized the declining influence of the U.S. government around the world. The plane that crashed into the Pennsylvania farm field symbolized that all of this impacted the average American. You see, you can suggest similarities and imitation, but it's nonsense. You've got to show a causal connection between the two, and Dennis has not been able to do that in any of his work. You've got to show that they were connected. Now, he recognized that this was a problem, and he tried to come up with the 7th criterion that ancient readers recognize similarities between the Gospels and stories in the Homeric epics. But what he doesn't point out is that ancient people recognize similarities between actual historical events and those in the Homeric epics. I could give you several examples. None of it establishes imitation. And even if imitation is involved, and I think there are some possibilities in the Gospels where imitation may be involved, but I think it's no more than Homeric flavoring. You've got Josephus, he says this in his writings, Dennis does. Even Josephus, he says, and some Jewish scholars like Louis Feldman will say how the fall of Jerusalem, Josephus describes with Homeric flavoring, pointing out things in such a way to draw attention to the reader, saying, wow, the destruction of Jerusalem is similar in some ways to the destruction of Troy during the Trojan War back in the Homeric epics. Thank you. Give me one more. But no one turns around and says, well, I guess the destruction of Jerusalem is entirely fiction. No, it's just Homeric flavoring. And remember, Dennis's hypothesis is not merely that there's a little bit of Homeric flavoring in the Gospels. He's saying that they imitated to the point where they invented the stories and that they are almost entirely fiction. I don't believe he's proven the point, and I don't believe anything he said really calls into question the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. Thank you.
I cannot tell you how much I disagree with that analysis. Now, that doesn't mean I'm right, but it does mean we have something to talk about. I found all of his suggestions forced. Yes, it is a problem to have psyche or psychikon related to the body, but in the context, Paul is talking about, he's interpreting Genesis. And in Genesis, there's the phrase psychikon zosan, and the soul becomes living, and it becomes living in a body. So I think contextually, it still is talking about a body. Yes, you can say flesh and bone can be a figure, but it's in the context of Paul saying it's not a physical, it's not a psychikon body, it's a spiritual one. And Mike, I don't know how you can claim that the spiritual body is the spirit coming down and then claiming bodies and then raising bodies up, when he says flesh and bone can inherit the kingdom of God. And the gospel writers don't affirm that, in my view. The Q document does know that Jesus died. Take up your cross and follow me. That's in the Q document. Don't fear those who can kill the body, but those who can kill the soul. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets who are sent to you, which includes John and Jesus for the author. So he knows that Jesus has died, and he's saying, you won't see me again until I come back in glory. The business, I'm going to spend most of my time on mimesis, as you might imagine. No, I want to come back to say one other thing about your major presentation. Hundreds of people in ancient texts claimed to see the dead rise and walking around. Sometimes they're in spiritual form. Sometimes they're in bodies. And by the way, I think Paul had a vision. And I think he is citing visions of people in the circle of the 12 who had similar visions. The Corinthians thought it was a soul that was disembodied from the body. And we know of that from Homer, that people can see disembodied souls. But how do we make a judgment of, a lot of people have seen Elvis Presley. A lot of people every year see the Virgin Mary. How do we make judgments about it? And by the way, some of these people die for their visions. So this idea that people believe the visions and so on, and that many people had the visions, is nothing new in ancient literature. But I want to go to mimesis. If you can find a way to explain the parallels that I put up for you about Odyssey 24 and that text, I'd like to have an explanation. I can show you many people who imitated that very text, including Jewish authors. The idea that you have the recognition by a scar, and their eyes were kept from seeing him. These are verbal similarities in Greeks. This is not random. Now, I grant the point that a judgment about literary connection is not a historical judgment. I agree with that, Mike. On the other hand, if you have almost everything in the story explainable by the model, it means that there's very little to account for as historical, especially when Luke, who knows the Acts of the Apostles, doesn't mention 500 appearances. He differs with Paul and says that it's a physical body. And Mike, I think you're playing a shell game with us. I think you've got a commitment theologically, and you're scraping the barrel to find arguments and information. So I think all of your examples are problematic. And here's a major point that I want to make. And it has to do with social identity criticism. And this is going to get in the weeds and very scholarly, but I think you'll see why it matters. Social identity theory is simply interested in how social groups in the modern world, but also in antiquity, organize themselves. And groups like Washburn University or your churches identify themselves by certain characteristics. And often those characteristics get identified with what's called a prototypical leader. Your social groups also have social boundaries, and you identify outsiders who are villains or don't share your values, whether it's in politics, whether it's in race, whether it's in gender. And it's a major problem in our culture that we have become so polarized between stereotyped in-groups and out-groups. In the Gospels, of course, Jesus is the prototypical leader in all the Gospels. So I'm going to read this to you. What kind of book is a Gospel? It is not, as Mike seems to assume, a history or a biography. It's a foundational narrative for a community. And it functions by praising the prototypical leader, Jesus, of a self-stereotyped in-group, the disciples and others, to distinguish it from stereotyped out-groups, Pharisees, chief priests, Gentiles, Romans, often rivaling their own narratives. That's where mimesis comes in. It comes in the contestation between the in-group and the out-group. And mimesis happens in the Jewish Bible in controversies with Jews, and in Greek poetry, especially the Iliad and the Odyssey. But I want, final remark. I want to know why 5 chapters out of 90 in the Gospels get all the attention on this topic. We have 4 chapters of infancy stories. We have 80 about Jesus' championing the poor, about his parables, about his predictions of the future, about his commissioning the disciples, about his talking about ethics. That's the Jesus we should be talking about, not some mythical notion that people saw him after his death. Jesus had no responsibility for or agency in that he was raised. That's what God did for him. But that's what the community had to say, because they were so crushed at Jesus' death that they couldn't let his death be the final word. And in different ways, the gospel authors and Paul affirm that God would not let Jesus' career go unfulfilled. But the idea that we can trust that there is a bodily resurrection or a bodily resurrection in the future for people seems to me very, very unhistorical and unscientific.
So a reminder then, each of our debaters gets 10 minutes to ask questions of the other. Dr. Licona is going to ask questions first. Do you want this one, or are you going to use that one now? Okay.
Hello? Is this on? Cool. All right, let's do it. Okay, so Dennis, you said Paul and the disciples had visions. Okay, so that's typically the way I would take that would be that they had experiences of Jesus that were, they were non-corporeal, they were not within space-time, they were more in like dreams or hallucinations, something like that. Is that what you mean?
No, I don't know what it means. I know that Paul claims to have seen the risen Christ. Okay. Whether he's doing that in a dream or vision, I don't know.
Okay, but you would say it's some kind of a psychological thing then, right?
I think that if somebody said they had seen Elvis, that would be my first impression, and I'd have to be proven, have it proved otherwise.
Okay, but when you say Paul and the disciples saw visions, what do you think's the cause, whether it was in space-time or outside, whether it was physical or immaterial, what do you think was the cause of those visions?
I think it's willful wishing.
Willful wishing.
That God did it because Jesus' career needed vindication.
So why would Paul wish? If he thought Jesus was a failed Messiah and false prophet and he was out persecuting the church, why would he wish to see Jesus?
No, Paul does not have that story. That's in Acts, and I don't think that's historical. It comes right out of the Bacchae. When Luke tells the story, he quotes the Bacchae. It is hard for you to kick against the goads.
Okay, so
that's a quote. No.
You trust Luke then? You think Acts is historical?
Paul understands by his call, by his vision, is that he now is to preach the gospel to Gentiles.
Right.
It's not a conversion call.
So do you think he had some kind of an experience? In
yes,
other words,
I do think he had
that he thought was Jesus.
Well, sorry?
That you thought he had an experience that he interpreted as the risen Jesus.
Yes.
And what do you think was the cause of that? It wasn't wishful thinking, of course. So what was it?
I don't know what the cause is of people having visions.
Okay, so for one reason, for whatever reason that you can't explain, you have no idea whatsoever why Paul thought he saw the risen Jesus.
No, I don't. And my wife has visions, and I don't know what caused it except my cooking.
Okay. Right, and she probably wouldn't die for your cooking. She probably wouldn't give up her life.
She might die from the cooking.
Yeah. She probably wouldn't change her life. I mean, I think for Paul...
No, people die for visions all the time, Mike, and you know that.
Of course, I'm not disputing that, Dennis. But for Paul to go from persecuting the church to all of a sudden become one of the persecuted and dying as a Christian martyr, that is so unlikely. I think it's more likely that Nancy Pelosi becomes the chair of the 2024 campaign of Donald Trump for president because she likes the slogan, Make America Great Again, than it is that Paul would convert to Christianity.
Mark, here's a challenge. I want you to show me one verse that says that that vision of the risen Christ was the reason he converted or had his theology. What he says is that that was a message to bring the message to the Gentiles. That is Paul saying the vision was his conversion. That's not what Paul says.
Okay, but Paul says, all right, so if you're going, you quoted from Acts about kicking against the goads. So are you considering that as Paul's view or not?
No, it's Luke's view.
Okay, so if it's not Paul's view, let's exclude Acts for now and just look at Paul.
Yeah, fine.
So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So he believes that he has this experience of the risen Jesus, and he believes
he does.
and the other apostles do too.
And he thinks the others did too, and he probably thinks 500 people had it.
That's right.
But Luke doesn't think that.
Right. Well, no, what do you mean? Luke doesn't think that.
Well, why wouldn't he say it in the Acts of the Apostles?
Well, you don't have to cover everything
No, come
all
on,
the time.
Mike, come on.
All right. So, but Paul talks about these things, and then you mentioned about the disciples. Well, you asked me to talk about the Odyssey, chapter 24, so I'll wait and let you ask me that question later on. What I would do when say Paul believed in physical bodily resurrection, let's go back to 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 17. And there, remember, Paul says, I don't want you to grieve as those who have no hope. Christ is going to bring back with him those who have died in him. So he's going to bring back the spirits of the dead. But then he says, and then the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised. Well, wait a minute. If they're coming back with him, who's going to be raised? That can only mean that their spirits are going to be reunited with their corpses.
Oh, come on. No, how do you get the spirit coming down?
Okay, then tell me how you interpret it. What's being raised? Who are the dead in Christ being raised if he's bringing the dead in Christ back with him?
Well, he's bringing the dead, and we shall meet the Lord in the air.
No, then he says, and then the dead will be raised.
And that for Paul would have been a spiritual death. Now, I would say, and I think you'd agree with this actually, Mike, Paul changes his mind about this imagery in his later epistles, so that
He changes his mind about what?
he uses the image of we must put off the body and,
between first and
recover
second
the divine
Corinthians.
image, which was the soul. And this is like a Platonic interpretation, Philonic interpretation.
I don't take that as being changing his mind. I think by the time he gets to 2 Corinthians, what he's referring to is 2 Corinthians 2:8 or 4:16 through 5:8. He is talking about the intermediate state.
No, but in chapter 5 of 2 Corinthians, he says, it's not that we would put off the body, but that would be clothed in addition, so that this in addition to the body is the spiritual encasement that allows for the resurrection. I'm not sure we're going to settle this tonight.
No, I think I think we might be on the same, we might interpret a little different, but I agree with you that he's talking about a further clothing.
That's
there.
right.
Yeah. All right, one final question for you. You said in your rebuttal that we should be talking more about Jesus and not this question about his resurrection because there's so much in the Gospels about his teachings. I agree with you, and we do. That's what we do when we talk theology. It's what we do when we just talk about practical Christian living. We talk about the Sermon on the Mount. I love the Sermon on the Mount. I've memorized Matthew's version of the Sermon on the Mount. I love it so much. So the teachings of Jesus are important, of course. But tonight we're here to talk about his resurrection. What do we mean by resurrection? And did it actually occur? And I'm speaking as a historian here, that I'm wanting to look at the historical question and saying, all right, we can know that Jesus' disciples truly believed that he rose from the dead and had appeared to them. What's the best explanation for that? You say visions, but you have no idea what caused those visions. I think that the best explanation is Jesus actually rose and appeared to them, because I showed how it's probably not hallucinations and it wasn't a metaphor, and you start to run out of explanations. The only thing left really that adequately explains it in my mind is Jesus actually rose from the dead.
Okay, on this point, I want to just be fine-tuning the differences between us and then maybe open it up to the audience if it's appropriate to do so soon.
You have an opportunity to ask questions.
In my view, it's the 80 chapters that are not about resurrection that caused the 5 chapters about resurrection. That people were so grateful for Jesus' message and so hopeful that his understanding of the kingdom of God would usher in some liberation and a relaxing of Torah. And when he was so badly crucified, there was cognitive dissonance, and we know in the history of failed prophecies and so on that when people suffer great agony, they have to compensate for it with some kind of hope. And this is actually the hope in your opening remarks of why people, if we live in such a miserable world with COVID and racism and nationalism and war, we want religion and some security, don't we? And so we are vulnerable to these notions of life, and I think the early Christians were too. So I think that's what issues into the hope of early Christians, resurrection of the body, not resurrection of the body, and so on, so that the 80 chapters in the Gospels lead to the 5, and the 5 don't justify us thinking that Jesus is the Son of God in the 80 before. So.
Final comment, and then I'll turn it over to you. My comment in response to that would be good historical practice must account for the maximum amount of knowable facts. And what you just said does not account for Paul, because Paul was not grieving over Jesus' death. He wasn't trying to figure out what was going on there. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So he's not grieving over Jesus' death and trying to make sense out of it. And his argument that if Christ was not raised, we're not going to be raised. If we're not going to be raised, the Christian life is not worth living. But Christ was raised, therefore we will be raised, therefore the Christian life is worth living. That argument makes no sense whatsoever unless they truly believed Jesus had been raised from the dead.
Did I hear you say, Mike, that Jesus didn't grieve Jesus' crucifixion? Did I hear you say that?
That Jesus didn't grieve his
That's
crucifixion?
what I heard you say.
How did you hear me say that?
Because I thought that's what you said. He's preaching the crucified. It's well, I forget his imagery, but it's as bad as it gets. It's the nadir of human experience to have a noble person like that die, like Hector died in the Odyssey, or like Socrates being so unfairly killed, and so on.
And that might apply to the disciples. It doesn't apply to Paul.
Paul grieved.
Paul grieved over Jesus' death?
Yes, of course.
What evidence do you have for that?
Because he talks about the crucifixion as the most dismal thing one can imagine.
Only because he's a believer at that point.
I'm sorry?
He's a believer at that point. He's not grieving over Jesus' death as a non-believer. He's out persecuting the church. He's glad Jesus is dead.
Mike,
but go ahead, you can start asking questions.
Yeah.
No, I cede my time. I'd rather go to the audience.
Okay. Sure. Okay, so if you have questions, we'd ask you to come forward to one of the microphones on either side. What I would ask you to do is tell us your name, tell us who you're directing your question to, and be concise. Don't give speeches. Be concise. Ask a question. So, but go ahead, right here.
Hey, it's my voice. Anyway, Dennis, I have a question for you, and that is, are you aware of any historical documents from within the 1st or 2nd centuries that talk about the early church fathers and the early followers of Jesus from the way that you see them as a bunch of very grieved and very hurting people who are simply out of their minds insane and have no evidence for their beliefs?
Well, I think I gave you the evidence that's there. It's in the Gospels that Jesus did not appear to the disciples, that there is very little confirmation. I mean, it's not appearance to the 12. Paul doesn't know about Judas. Mark makes Judas and Mary Magdalene up, and Joseph of Arimathea too. They all have analogies in Homer. So I think I've given you the evidence. Now, most of the people that Mike cited are theologians, and they're in the Pauline tradition. That would be true for Clement, to some extent probably Polycarp. And so they're going to be Pauline interpreters. So yeah. Now, by the way, let me be clear. I think all people who were involved in the writing of the New Testament believed that God had vindicated Jesus.
All right. My
Everyone.
question was if there was anyone outside of those people who wrote about those people with the same view that you have about them.
No, I not that I know of.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go this way.
Okay, my question's also for Dr. McDonald. One of your biggest points was that Jesus was raised by God and not by himself. This disregards one of the biggest foundations of the Christian faith, the Holy Trinity, saying that they are all one. So how is Jesus, or if Jesus is God, how is God raising him raising part of himself passive? Does that make sense?
It doesn't to me.
So if they are all one, like the Holy Trinity, you were saying that it was passive, Jesus raising himself, but if Jesus and God are the same person, how would that be passive?
Can you understand the question?
I think she's saying, and it's a little bit, honestly, it's a little difficult to hear up here. But I think what you are saying is, under the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, you've got Father, Son, Holy Spirit that make up one God. And he was saying that God raised Jesus is what it says. It doesn't talk about Jesus raising himself, but if Jesus is part of the Trinity, then he was part of that? Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm a Christian who doesn't believe in the Christian God. Okay? So Trinity talk is another wonderful mythology that it sustains some people, but I just don't think there's, that's where I would be. I'm a humanist. I'm not against religion. I'm a humanist. I'm actually for religion, but I want it to be responsible to itself, and I don't want it to hurt people the way that religion is hurting us now.
Okay, we'll go this way.
Okay, hold on. Can I just say something real quick about religion hurting us now? Atheism's hurting us now too. And I just want to point out that it was atheists in the 20th century, Mao, who murdered about 70 million people. It was Stalin who murdered millions. Between the two atheists alone, they murdered more people and butchery in the 20th century.
I do not deny that.
So there is some evil in religion. I understand that. But there's evil in every worldview. You can't judge a philosophy by its abuse. Certainly Jesus did not condone such action.
You can't judge religion or philosophy by what it does? Did I hear you say that?
You can't judge a philosophy by its abuse. Okay?
That's the only way you can judge a philosophy.
So if Jesus taught to love our enemies,
already, Mike.
If Jesus taught us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us, what do we do about the Crusades and the Inquisition? Well, that was against what Jesus taught.
I agree with you.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Well, you talk about how there are like 80 chapters that explain the 5 chapters of Jesus' death and resurrection. How do you explain Jesus himself in passages where he talks about the temple being destroyed and being raised, and they shall see no sign other than the sign of Jonah, which is of course him being in the belly of the fish and then coming out, where Jesus himself is basically prophesying his own death and resurrection, and then when all of this happens and Jesus is raised, the disciples go, aha, that's what he meant there. So there are how would you explain
Okay,
those?
the business about the sign of Jonah and being raised only appears in the Matthean version. The sign of Jonah is preaching. It is not a miracle. It's not being in the heart of the earth for 3 days. And Jesus does not anticipate anywhere his vindication by God, except at the end of time, when he'll come back in just. And by the way, I don't think Jesus is going to return at the end of time either. So if you want to just kind of take me out and crucify me too, I can imagine that. But we have been too innocent about the radicalism of the New Testament, and I think we've cloaked it in the notion that it must be fine because God raised Jesus from the dead.
First, I just want to thank both of you for coming out, especially Dr. McDonald. It's hard to be in a hostile audience, so I really appreciate and respect you coming and sharing with us. This question is for both of you. A lot of discussion has been revolving around 1 Corinthians 15 and proper interpretation of what Paul meant, whether it was a spiritual resurrection or a physical bodily one. But if one of the verses, or two of the verses I didn't hear discussed today, I'd like to hear both of your interpretations or understanding of it. 1 Corinthians 15, 35 through 36, and I'll just read it for the sake of the audience, I'm sure you both know it, where Paul says, "But some will say, how are the dead raised? And with what kind of body do they come?" He says, "You fool, that which you sow does not come to life unless it dies." To me, it sounds like he's speaking of a physical body dying and a physical body being raised. He's speaking about the same thing in verse 36. And it seems to be the physical body, but I'd like to hear both of your interpretations on that. Thank you.
That is exactly right. There are different kinds of bodies. There's one that is sown and another raised. What is sown is, for Paul, a physical body, and it's sown in the ground. But it's raised a spiritual body. Now, the phrase that he says, with what kind of body is the resurrection going to happen, should be said with sarcasm as though it's coming from his opponents. Oh yeah, if there's a resurrection of the dead, what kind of body is he going to be? It's not going to be flesh and bone, is it? Because that's what you say in this text. And so they want to know, they don't think there's going to be a resurrection of the body, because what could that possibly mean? And Paul is stretching things to make it a spiritual body. So that's why he has, and it's a perfect passage. Actually, in my opening remarks earlier, I cited that passage and then didn't think I had time for it.
So I think that about what it's sown and raised, and talking about that seed analogy, it is talking about the continuity. So what goes down in burial is what comes up in resurrection. It's transformed, of course, it's different, but there's a continuity between the corpse and the body that's raised, just as you have with the seed. There's continuity, of course, there's differences, but there is a continuity between them. Again, I just want to reemphasize that when Paul uses the term spiritual here, he is not meaning it in a sense of ethereal or immaterial. He is using it more in the sense of a spiritually animated body, something that is animated by the Holy Spirit. If Paul wanted to use this comparison between physical and immaterial, he had used a similar contrast in chapter 9 when he says, hey, look, if I sowed spiritual things among you, meaning his teachings, don't I have the right to reap physical things? And so he uses the term sarkikos, pneumatikos and sarkikos there. So if he was doing this with the body, he had already used that seed analogy and this comparison just a few chapters earlier, but he doesn't. He uses psychikos, which never means physical, never, versus pneumatikos.
Thanks for coming out. My name is Stephen. I've got a question kind of for both of you, but primarily for you, Dr. McDonald. So when you were establishing your opening points, you focused briefly on Mark 16, verse 6. in establishing that Jesus' resurrection was a passive action. And I've been flipping through different translations, and every single one, none of the wider used translations of the New Testament have that as passive. And this is just the first part of the question. Could you explain to me how you got there? And I know the two of you both know your Greek.
I got it from the Greek. Agergetai.
Okay. It's a verb.
It's a verb, yeah. I mean, I'll read it to you. Agerthi. He was crucified, and he was raised up, Agerthi in this case, but it becomes Agergetai elsewhere. It's a passive. God does it. He's the agent of passive verb.
Okay. Why then are all the major translations of...
I'm sorry?
Why then are all the major translations of Mark not translating that in a passive sense in English?
Maybe they failed Greek too.
Okay. And my second part of that is, when you quoted that verse, you left out a part at the end, and I wanted to ask why, and because you quoted it, and this isn't the translation you used, I expect you translated it yourself. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed, you seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here." And you left out, "See the place where they laid him." So my question for you is, what do you think happened to the body then?
I think it rotted in a tomb, like mine's going to.
Okay. And why do you think here it says that they were pointing out?
I'm sorry?
Why do you think here it says that they were pointing out that this empty space was here where the body was?
No, he really died. He was buried in a tomb.
But the space is empty.
Look, all early Christians think that Jesus was vindicated in some way. And some argued that he died and there was a spiritual raising, there was the soul raising. But it would be very difficult for me to imagine justifying a claim about anybody that their body didn't rot in a tomb. I'd like to see an example of that in science.
Thank you.
Hey, I'd just like to throw in something. The earliest Christians, and the disciples is who we're really concerned about here, not what others said. You go to the Gospel of Thomas, which is probably mid to late 2nd century in my opinion. Some will date Thomas a little earlier than that. But Thomas has two thoughts about resurrection. In Logia 37 and 51, resurrection is referred to as disembodiment and enlightenment, respectively. And of course, there were some also who interpreted resurrection as spiritual, immaterial, things like this. But remember, we're concerned for the question about resurrection. Did it actually occur? The main thing we're looking at is, what did the original disciples say about resurrection? That's what's most important. And they said Jesus had been raised from the dead and had appeared to them. And I've shown several times through Paul that Paul believed in a physical bodily resurrection, despite Dennis's contentions to the contrary. He's pretty clear that he means a physical bodily resurrection. And that means that the other disciples did as well.
Can I real quickly just add one last final part to that?
Stephen says, I know Stephen's academic advisor really well. And he's like this all the time. He always has one more question. So I'm his advisor. So Stephen, I'm going to go this way. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Lacona and Dr. McDonald, for coming out. I know a lot of work went into this. Thank you both. And I wanted to make sure I understand you correctly. Did you say that God raised Jesus from the dead, but Jesus did not raise himself?
Right.
Okay. How do you interpret what Jesus said in John 2 about destroy this temple and in 3 days I will rise it up again? And earlier or later in John chapter 11, Jesus said, I lay down my life, I choose to take it up again.
No, those are very good observations. I don't think Jesus said them. The Gospel of John is later, and in one of those cases at least, he's relating to the synoptics. Now, I think I said that it almost always is the case that you have God raise Jesus from the dead. But in the Gospel of John, it is an exception. It's very perceptive.
Okay, by what authority do you say Jesus never said those things? You accept some things that Jesus said in the Gospels, but you reject other things that Jesus said. By what authority do you decide what is authentic and what is not?
Again, that's a very good question, but historians have to set out criteria about what they think is likely for Jesus to have said and not to have said. People may have heard about the Jesus Seminar. It ran on for years, and scholars got together and argued over criteria to determine which things Jesus likely said and which ones didn't. And so in this regard, I really am following what I consider to be the consensus of critical scholarship. But again, it's a very good question. Criteria are needed to determine that. You just can't lump it all together and say it's all, everything that is attributed to Jesus is a red letter.
Okay. I have more questions, but I'll take off. So thank you both. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Josh. I've got a question for both of you. So the end of Mark being Mark 16:8, from the presentation, there's what's known as the short version and the long version. Can you tell me, so the long version being Mark continuing from verses 9 to 20, which of those do you, like, what manuscripts do you look at to determine if Mark should end at 8 or if it should continue on to verses 9 to 20?
On this question, there really is no serious debate. The longer ending is later. It shows evidence of knowing Matthew and Luke. It's correcting a perceived problem in the text, and it does appear relatively early. It appears in the 2nd century already. But the most trustworthy manuscripts don't have it, and if they knew of it, they surely would have included it. Good question.
Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I do. You'd be hard-pressed. Well, is this on? Yeah. You'd be hard-pressed to find a scholar today who thinks that the longer or shorter ending of Mark is authentic. They believe that Mark ends with chapter 16, verse 8. But the question is why? And it is so awkward. Now, there's certainly no consensus on the answer why it ends that way. In fact, there are probably more explanations out there on why it ends that way than there are New Testament scholars positing them. My guess is that Mark's ending was lost, is what I think. You have Jesus. I think that it's historical, that he predicted his imminent death and resurrection. I've written on this, I've published on it. So I do think that it is historical that he predicted his death and resurrection. And we have some decent evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So why would Mark end there? I think it was probably lost. Or for some reason, maybe he was in prison or he got sick and was unable to complete it. We just don't know.
It is an enigma, and scholars are going to have different interpretations, one of which is that even though the women didn't tell the disciples to see Jesus in Galilee, Galilee may be a cipher for Gentile mission, and it's up to the reader to go tell about the resurrected Jesus. So, and that's really very attractive to preachers, but to other critical scholars too. So it's a very good question. It is an enigma, but it almost certainly is that the Gospel of Mark ended there in chapter 8. I, of course, argue that it's Mark's way of getting Jesus off the hook for the disciples not learning that they should see Jesus in Galilee, not in Jerusalem.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Haley Weisenbach, and I actually have a question for you, Dr. McDonald. You talk about how you are a historian and how you, appreciate evidence and facts, and I'm a facts girl. So I was wondering, you presented this powerful demonstration of the similarities between these sections of the gospel and those Homeric epics, and you make this very important and imperative assertion that those similarities are directly correlated with the fact that they were copied. There's no room for judgment as to whether or not that was actually true. There was no evidence there. That was a very quick assumption that you made, and I was just wondering if there was any factual evidence that you had, because one of your key assertions was that that type of prose was taught in schools. So who is to say that the authors of the gospel were not taught how to write in a similar fashion, and those writings that were later composed resemble that? I mean, we are taught to write specific ways in schools, and our writings all resemble one another's. So who's to say, and that's just one example, who's to say that the similarities that are seen between those two texts are directly correlated to the fact that they were copied?
Okay, if people knew how to read, they knew how to write like that. That's how they were taught to write. And the parallels that I was able to give today are just one good example of many, many, many. The Gerasene demoniac story is a retelling of the Polyphemus story. In Circe, Jesus turns soldiers into swine. You have the recognition of Jesus by an anointed woman, which is the Niptra in Odyssey 19. You have visitations of the dead in chapter 11. The Sea of Galilee is never called that before Mark, and Jesus is sailing the sea all over the place with disciples who can't understand him, and he can calm the sea. Well, those are themes that come out of the Odyssey. So when you see this globally, and by the way, I think your question is a very good one. I'm not trying to put you off. I'm actually trying to answer it. I'm not in a position to say, in the example that I gave you, that Luke knew nothing about Jesus' resurrection. I'm just saying that there's nothing left in the story to give me hope that there is. That's all.
It is false that when he says it's never, he's half true, half correct when he says it's never referred to the Sea of Galilee prior to Mark. And he has to go that way because he thinks Mark is inventing calling it a sea in order to compete with the Odyssey. But in the Old Testament, there are references to the Sea of Chinnereth or something like that. And so they don't call it the Sea of Galilee, but they refer to it as a sea. And it's also referred to as a sea in the Jerusalem Talmud. So 1,000 years before the New Testament is referred to a sea, and 100 or so years after the New Testament it's referred to as a sea. So Mark did not invent that term.
No, I'm not saying Mark invented the idea of the sea, but the phrase the Sea of Galilee. And when Luke rewrites it, he always calls it a lake.
And back to that comparison of those texts. Back to the comparison of those texts, you also made a key assertion towards the end of one of your slides that said that the more times that we see these comparisons, the more that we can equate the two as being copied and being synonymous. Where did you get that doctrine from?
Can you repeat the question?
I didn't hear it.
I'm so sorry.
It's hard up here.
So at the end of one of your slides, you made the key assertion that the more times that those similarities were seen between the Homeric epics and the biblical text, the more time that those similarities were drawn, the more likely that the two were somehow correlated, that the two were somehow, one was copied from the other. And where did you get that doctrine? I mean, you've already made a comment about how historians have to make certain rules.
Oh, no, that's a very good question. And the way scholars talk about it is, what is the genre of a gospel? Is it a history in which we can test it against other information? Is it a biography in which we can test it against what we know about a person? Or is it a fiction that is internally coherent and we know what the author's agenda is and what the models are? And in the case of Mark and Luke Acts, it's clear that the models primarily come not from the Bible, they come from Greek poetry. But the reason we haven't seen it is most of us haven't read Aeschylus in the last 2 days. We just don't know this stuff, the way that these people knew it. By the way, I want to give you one statistic. If early Christians knew a book It was not the Septuagint. It was not a copy of the Bible. It was a copy of Homer. During this period, we have catalogs of papyri. We have 600 just of Homer, not to mention Plato and Euripides and so on. We have 5 fragments of the Septuagint. 5 against more than 600. So Homer was the beginning, the middle, and the end of Greek culture. That's a quotation from one of Mark's contemporaries. And we simply have been blind to it. And I'm hoping that I can encourage you to read Homer on your own.
I would say that by far the large, very large majority of critical scholars today view the Gospels as biographies and therefore a historical genre. Now, that's not to say that they believe everything in them, okay? But they say that they were written and intended to be understood as historical recollections of Jesus. If what Dennis is saying is true, that they were just simply foundational fictional stories, I would anticipate that they would write in such a genre, and that would be novel or epic or poetry, but that's not what they're written in. They're written as biographies, and they have all these different characteristics of biographies. Also, I would anticipate that you would find a significant number of early people, readers of the Gospels, interpret them as intended fictions. But you don't find it with the early Christians. Whenever you date 2 Peter or whoever the author is, you would still, 2 Peter 1:16 says, we did not follow cleverly devised myths, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So they're taking the transfiguration as historical. You've got Clement of Rome saying the disciples were greatly encouraged when they saw the risen Jesus. So he's thinking of it as historical. You have Ignatius in the first decade of the 2nd century saying that the virgin birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus, alethos, truly occurred. I would also want to look and see the skeptics. They also interpreted the Gospels as being intended historical accounts, because we know that from the way they answered it. They said, well, the tomb was empty because the disciples stole the body, or the gardener reburied the body, or Jesus faked his death. And so they're answering historical claims. And then notice how the Christians responded. They didn't say, oh, you misunderstand. These are just foundational fictional accounts like the Homeric epics. No, they defended the historicity of the empty tomb, of the resurrection, and the miracles and teachings of Jesus. So I don't see anything that really justifies Dennis's position. A little Homeric flavoring, perhaps on occasion, but outright invention to imitate the Homeric epics, not a chance.
Thank you.
You know I have a lot to say about that, but I'm not going to.
I'm actually going to apologize to those of you in line. We're actually over time, so I have to wrap it up. So I'm sorry we're not going to get to your questions. Really great. I mean, those are some great questions. Really appreciate your participation and your willingness to ask questions. Let me remind you, students, it's almost time for spring registration for classes. So sign up for a class in religious studies. Come take the Reformation. I'm teaching the Reformation in the spring, which is by far the most important class at the university. So come don't stop learning. Buy Dr. McDonald's books. Buy Dr. Lacona's books. Keep learning. I mean, it's fascinating stuff, and you really need to dive in and just read and learn at every opportunity. If you would, please join me in thanking both of our speakers tonight for a wonderful job. So one more time, agreeable disagreement really is at the heart of learning. It's so important to the experience of learning, and you've seen it at its very best here tonight. So thank you again for coming. Thank you to Christian Challenge, of course, for putting on this type of event to give you an opportunity to learn. So keep learning and stay safe. Thank you.